Welcome to Project Blackwood. We're doing something a little different today. We dig into the stories behind businesses that shaped industries
Yeah,
and sometimes fell apart.
right.
Today, we're examining a company that is practically synonymous with an entire national economy, but one that is currently fighting a really quiet, really dangerous war for its own future.
And losing ground, honestly.
Yeah, exactly. Let's explore what happened with Samsung, because I was looking at the numbers this morning, and the scale is just, it's hard to wrap your head around.
Oh, it's staggering.
It is. But when you look under the hood, there's this massive disconnect between how much hardware they push out into the world and how much money they actually take home.
It creates a really fascinating tension. I mean, we usually equate ubiquity with dominance, right? You see a Samsung phone in every other hand on the subway or a Samsung TV in every living room, and you just assume they are winning the game.
Sure, you think they own the market.
But the financial reality, the actual margin trend is much more complicated.
Right. And that is exactly what I want to dig into for this deep dive. We are looking at what is arguably the most important hardware manufacturer on Earth, yet it seems trapped in a crisis of its own making.
And to understand that crisis, we have to understand the sheer magnitude of this beast. And to do that, you have to go back to the very beginning.
Let's do.
And I don't mean the 1980s tech boom, I mean 1938.
Okay, 1938. So picture this. We are in Daegu, Korea. It's pre-World War II. Korea's under Japanese occupation at this point. There's a dusty street, and on that street is a small wooden storefront. The sign out front reads, Samsung Sangho.
Translates to 3 stars, by the way.
3 stars, right. Inside, you have a 28-year-old man named Lee Byung-chul. He has 40 employees, and his grand vision, his entire business model at this stage is trading noodles, locally grown produce, and dried fish.
Dried fish from Pohang, specifically. He was exporting them over to Manchuria and Beijing.
It's just such a humble image. Dried fish. And the total capital he put into this venture was 30,000 won. If you adjust that for inflation and exchange rates, you're looking at an initial investment of about 25 US dollars.
It sounds like literally nothing today. But in that context, it was a start. A market validation pace, if you will. He found a trade route that worked.
And from that $25 dried fish stand, you fast forward to 2024. That same entity generated roughly 300 trillion Korean won in revenue.
Which is about 220 billion US dollars.
220 billion. With a market cap hovering near $876 billion.
The numbers are so big they just become abstract. So let's ground it for you listening. This single entity, the wider Samsung Group, dictates roughly 13% of South Korea's entire gross domestic product.
13%.
Yeah. Imagine as Google, Apple, and General Motors were all one single company. And then on top of that, that company was also responsible for building your apartment complex, running your life insurance, and building the cargo ships that bring goods to your country.
It's a state within a state.
That is Samsung in Korea.
But, and here is our mission for today. We aren't here just to look at the up and to the right growth chart. We're here to dissect what might be the most dangerous moment in this company's history.
Absolutely.
Because despite that massive revenue, despite shipping 222 million phones in a single year, there's a fundamental crack in the foundation.
It really comes down to the difference between volume and value. Samsung is currently the undisputed king of volume. They ship more units than anyone,
Right.
but they are losing the war on value. The profit margins are eroding. And when you look at the data, specifically regarding the rise of AI and semiconductors, you see a company fighting an existential crisis.
So we're going to trace this arc. We want to look at the sheer grit that built the empire, the violent cultural revolutions that saved it once before, and the Achilles heel that might be dragging it down today.
And it really is a story about mindset. That's the thread you have to follow. How does a company built on command and control efficiency, military-style execution survive in a creative, software-driven world?
Well, let's start with those origins, the foundational mindset. We mentioned the founder, Lee Byung-chul. He wasn't exactly a rags to riches story, was he?
No, not in the traditional sense. He was actually a wealthy heir. He dropped out of Waseda University in Tokyo after his father died. He had family money, and he decided to use it.
Okay.
But what makes him interesting isn't the capital he started with, it's his adaptability. He starts with noodles and fish. But then the Korean War hits in the early 1950s.
Which obviously upends everything.
Completely. He has to literally flee, moving operations to Busan in 1950 to escape the fighting. But this is where you see the first flash of what I call the chaebol mindset.
Can you define chaebol for us? Because you see that word in the Wall Street Journal or Bloomberg all the time, but the nuance is important.
Sure. A Taebol is a large family-owned business conglomerate in South Korea. The structure is incredibly unique. It's characterized by strong, centralized family control over management and an insane level of diversification.
Meaning they don't just stick to their lane?
Right, they have no lane. The mindset is diversify to survive. You don't just do one thing perfectly. You do everything well enough to control the entire ecosystem. So after the war, Lee shifts from trading to manufacturing. He looks at his war-torn country and asks, what do we actually need to rebuild?
And the answer was sugar.
Sugar.
Okay.
In 1953, he starts Cheil Sugar. It was Korea's first sugar refinery. Before that, they were importing everything. Then a year later, in 1954, he starts Cheil Industries to process wool. He builds the largest woolen mill in the entire country.
Okay, so we've got sugar and wool. To anyone looking at a tech giant today, that sounds completely random. Why does the company that made my smartwatch start with baking ingredients and sweaters?
Because cash is oxygen.
Okay.
This is a classic data to drama connection. These weren't random businesses, they were cash cows. Korea was rebuilding. Everyone needed clothes, everyone needed basic food staples.
They were funding the future.
Exactly. These low-tech industries generated the stable, massive cash flows that allowed him to make the really risky bets later on. You do not get the Galaxy smartphone in 2010 without the sugar refinery paying the bills in the 1950s.
It's the engine room of the empire.
Right. And he needed a massive engine because in 1969, he made the biggest bet of his life.
The electronics gamble.
January 1969, he found Samsung Electric Industries in Suwon. Now, you have to contextualize this. Korea in 1969 was not a high-tech hub. They didn't have the proprietary technology. They didn't have the specialized engineers. Samsung actually had to partner with Sanyo from Japan just to figure out how to put a basic television together.
And their first product was just a black and white TV, right?
Yeah.
In 1970.
Yes, and it was very basic. But then comes 1974, and this is a moment that, if you looked at the financial filings back then, looked absolutely terrible to every analyst.
You mean the acquisition of Korea Semiconductor?
Right. They bought a 50% stake.
And everyone thought this was a mistake.
They thought it was financial suicide. Why would a wool and sugar company get into the incredibly complex, capital-intensive world of semiconductors? Chips are notorious for brutal boom and bust cycles. It looked like a total money pit.
But it wasn't.
No. In hindsight, this is our first real revelation moment. This was the single most important decision in the company's history. It turns out this early choice foreshadowed their entire modern dominance.
What did Lee see that the analysts missed?
He saw that the industrial age was ending and the information age was beginning. He knew that low-margin textiles couldn't sustain a first-world economy long-term. By buying Korea Semiconductor, he laid the groundwork for everything. By 1983, they had developed their first 64-qubit DRAM chip.
Can you explain DRAM briefly? We hear that acronym a lot in tech circles.
DRAM stands for Dynamic Random Access Memory. Think of it as the short-term memory of a computer. It's where data is stored while the machine is actively using it. It's a commodity product, meaning one company's chip is largely the same as another's.
So it's a race to the bottom on price.
Exactly. The winner is whoever can manufacture the most of them for the absolute cheapest price. And this 1974 purchase started Samsung down the path of becoming the undisputed memory king.
So they're building this massive, diverse empire. But then in 1987, the founder, Lee Byung-chul, dies at age 77. And this triggers something historically referred to as the Great Division.
And this is crucial for understanding the confusing, tangled structure of Samsung today. When the patriarch died, the empire didn't just stay one big unified blob. It had to be split up among the heirs. It's very much like a royal succession.
So who got what?
Well, Shinsegae spun off. That's a massive retail and department store group. If you go to Korea today, you see Shinsegae everywhere. CJ Group spun off. They do food, biotechnology, and they own a huge chunk of the Korean entertainment and cinema industry. Hansol, which is paper and telecom, spun off, and the Juang Media Group.
So the empire is essentially carved up. What happened to Samsung Electronics?
It was left to stand alone, and this is the key takeaway. Losing those other reliable cash flows forced Samsung Electronics to hyper-focus on technology. They couldn't rely on the department stores or the sugar margins anymore. They had to win on tech because that's all they had left in that specific bucket.
Which leads us directly into the next era. The son, Lee Kun-hee, takes over as chairman. And honestly, this is where the business history turns into a movie script. We are entering the era of the Cultural Revolution.
Lee Kun-hee is just a fascinating character. He takes over, and he's not satisfied with just being big domestically. He travels to Los Angeles in 1993, and he visits a Best Buy.
A Best Buy in LA. I can just picture the fluorescent lights.
He walks down the aisles, actively looking for his company's products, and he finds them. Samsung TVs are sitting in the corner, gathering dust. They are priced cheaper than everything else, but nobody is buying them.
That must have been a massive gut check for a new chairman.
It was completely humiliating. He sees American customers walking right past Samsung to buy Sony or Panasonic. He realizes that in the eyes of the global market, Samsung is a second-tier, cheap alternative. They are the budget brand.
And for a man with his ambition, that was unacceptable.
It infuriated him. He realized that the volume mindset, just making a lot of cheap stuff, was actively killing the brand. So in June 1993, he summons 200 of his top executives. He doesn't call them to Seoul. He flies them all the way to the Kempinski Hotel in Frankfurt, Germany.
Why Frankfurt?
He was already there on business, and he basically just said, "Get over here now." This is known as the Frankfurt Declaration. It's legendary in business history. He holds a 3-day summit. He lectures them for hours, and he drops one of the most famous quotes in corporate history.
What was it?
He says, "Change everything except your wife and children."
Change everything except your wife and children. Such a dramatic line.
It was a total mandate. Shift from quantity to quality. He basically told them to reject the last 50 years of how they did business. He said, the quantity and quality ratio should not be 5 to 5. It should be 0 to 10. For the sake of quality, quantity must be sacrificed.
But hold on. Because executives say stuff like this at corporate retreats all the time. Quality is job one, customer first, all that PR speak. Usually they go back to the office on Monday and absolutely nothing changes. Did this actually mean anything?
That is a very fair skepticism. Usually it is just corporate fluff. But Lee Kun-hee backed it up with something incredibly drastic. He needed to prove he wasn't joking. And that brings us to the bonfire of the vanities in 1995.
This is the story that always blows my mind when researching them. But I have to ask, was this real or was it an elaborate PR stunt?
It was very real, and it was both. Here's the setup. Despite the Frankfurt meeting, in 1994, they launch a new mobile phone. And frankly, it's garbage. It has an 11.8% defect rate.
That's huge.
The hinges are breaking, the screens are failing. Lee Kun-hee finds out. And he decides that memos and speeches aren't enough anymore. He needs corporate shock therapy.
So he goes to the Gumi factory.
Right. He orders the entire inventory of that defective phone, 150,000 units, to be piled up in the factory courtyard.
150,000 phones.
Phones, fax machines, other inventory. The value is about 50 billion won. That's roughly $50 million in today's money. He gathers 2,000 employees in the courtyard. He makes them wear headbands that say quality first.
It sounds almost like a ritual.
It was a ritual sacrifice of inventory. He has 10 workers take heavy sledgehammers and smash the devices to pieces, and then they douse the pile in fuel and set it on fire.
They burned $50 million of their own product in front of the people who engineered it. I mean, From a Western business perspective, that looks insane. You're destroying assets.
From a Western perspective, it's incredibly wasteful. From a Confucian hierarchical perspective, it is a profound message. It signaled that the old rules of ship it at all costs were literally going up in smoke. It was a clear message: if you make junk, we will burn it, so don't make junk.
Did it actually work, though? Or did it just terrify the workforce?
The data says it worked. The defect rate dropped from 12% to 2% almost immediately following that event. It forced the engineers to rethink their entire QA process, and that quality push eventually paid off in a huge way.
Which leads to their rise to dominance against the Japanese giants in the early 2000s.
Yes. By 2006, they launched the Bordeaux LCD TV line. And that year, they do the unthinkable. They officially overtake Sony.
Sony was the Apple of the 80s and 90s. Beating them was a massive paradigm shift.
They captured 20% of the U.S. market share with that one line. This marked the end of Japanese hardware supremacy and the beginning of the Korean era. And at the exact same time, they were solidifying their position as the memory king with semiconductors.
I want to touch on their strategy there because you mentioned it earlier.
Yeah.
The counter-cyclical investment strategy. How exactly does that work?
It's basically a massive game of financial chicken. In the memory chip market, prices fluctuate wildly based on supply and demand. When demand drops, prices crash, and everyone loses money. A normal company cuts capital expenditure to survive the winter. Samsung does the exact opposite.
Wait, they spend more during a downturn?
They spend heavily. They build massive new fabrication plants while the market is crashing. They bleed cash purposefully.
Why?
Because when the market eventually bounces back, and tech demand always bounces back, they are the only ones with the new capacity to meet the surge in demand. Their competitors who cut spending can't catch up. They effectively starve out the competition. It's ruthless, and it requires incredibly deep pockets.
This goes all the way back to the sugar and wool money stabilizing the early conglomerate.
Ex-
So they are riding high. They've beaten Sony. They own the memory chip market. But hubris is a dangerous thing in business. And this brings us to what I think is the most painful part of the story for any Samsung shareholder, the fatal miss.
This is the definitive what went wrong chapter, and it hinges on a single meeting in late 2004.
The Android rejection. This is our second revelation moment.
Picture the scene. You have a guy named Andy Rubin. He flies to Seoul with a tiny team of 6 people. He has an idea for an open-source operating system for mobile handsets. He needs funding, and he needs a massive manufacturing partner to put the software on phones.
You pitching Android years before Google owned it.
Correct. And the price tag for the entire startup, about $50 million.
Which, ironically, is the exact amount they literally burned in the courtyard 10 years prior. They had the money.
They had the cash liquid. But the Samsung executives, they didn't just say no. According to Rubin, they laughed him out of the boardroom.
They left.
One executive reportedly looked at him and said, "You and what army are going to go and create this? You have 6 people. Are you high?"
Are you high? That is brutal. But why? Why were they so blind to it? It's easy to look back and say they were just arrogant, but was there a fundamental business logic for that reaction at the time?
We have to contextualize 2004 for a minute. The iPhone didn't exist yet. At that time, the power in the mobile industry wasn't with the phone makers or the software developers. It was entirely with the telecom carriers. Verizon, Vodafone, AT&T. They controlled what software was allowed on the phone. To a Samsung hardware executive, the phone was just a dumb pipe.
So they viewed software as an afterthought.
They viewed it as a utility, like plumbing. You don't pay extra for the plumbing, you pay for the physical house. They couldn't conceive that the operating system would become the actual product.
They thought, we make the hardware, that's where the margin is.
Exactly. They didn't see the platform shift coming. 2 weeks later, Google bought Android for $50 million.
And the rest is history.
It is a critical analytical insight for this whole deep dive. By rejecting the software layer, Samsung condemned itself to being a hardware-only player. They are forever paying rent to Google's ecosystem. They could have owned the platform that currently runs 70% of the world's smartphones. Instead, they just manufacture the metal and glass that runs it.
That's a staggering missed opportunity.
Yeah.
But even without owning Android, they still had a massive run. We have to give them credit for the Galaxy era.
Oh, absolutely. When the iPhone launched in 2007, it panicked the entire industry. Nokia and BlackBerry froze. But Samsung was the best at reacting. They adopted the fast follower strategy.
Which is a polite business term for copying.
We call it fast follower, but yes. They looked at what Apple did, and they replicated the form factor with incredible speed. They launched the Galaxy S series in 2009, but they did something Apple refused to do. They flooded the market.
Volume again, reverting to their roots.
With volume. They made cheap Galaxies, expensive Galaxies, big screens, small screens, ones with styluses. They wanted a phone at every single price point for every person on Earth.
And it worked, at least in terms of raw numbers.
Between 2011 and 2015, they reached their absolute peak. In 2015, they shipped 321 million units. They suffocated competitors like HTC and Motorola. They just drowned them in inventory. The global employee count swelled to 325,000 people.
But as we teased in the intro, volume isn't value. And there were subtle profit warning signs appearing beneath those massive shipment numbers.
Right. Even as top-line revenue climbed, the margins were eroding. Apple was capturing almost all the actual profit in the smartphone industry because they focused strictly on premium, high-margin devices. Samsung was doing the heavy lifting of manufacturing hundreds of millions of cheap budget phones for razor-thin margins.
As revenue climbed, margins dipped. It was hinting at an unsustainable scaling model. And we also have to mention the hubris of diversification again, touching back on the K-ball structure.
Yay.
It wasn't just phones they mismanaged. We have to talk about Samsung Motors.
Not a car company. Most people completely forget this even happened.
I had forgotten they tried to make cars until we pulled the research.
In the mid-90s, caught up in that expansionist mindset, Chairman Lee Kun-hee decided he personally loved cars, so Samsung should obviously manufacture cars. They launched the SM5 sedan in 1998.
1998, isn't that exactly when the Asian financial crisis hit?
Perfect timing, right? The Korean market cratered. The automotive division quickly racked up $1.8 billion in debt. They eventually had to sell it off to Renault for just $78 million. It was a financial disaster.
That's a massive haircut.
It was a clear warning sign. It showed that just because you have endless capital and brilliant engineering talent doesn't mean you can win in every single vertical.
Which brings us to the next major crisis. And this one wasn't just a financial write-off. It was a physical danger to the consumer. We need to talk about 2016 and the Galaxy Note 7.
The exploding phone.
I remember this vividly. Airlines were making announcements before takeoff banning them. You literally couldn't bring them on a plane.
The corporate context here is really important because it ties back to that fast follower pressure. Apple was about to launch the iPhone 7. The industry rumors were that it was going to be a boring update. Very few design changes. Samsung saw an opening to strike.
They wanted to beat them to the punch.
They thought, if we launch a revolutionary Note 7 with a massive battery and a beautiful, sleek design right before Apple's event, we can steal all their thunder.
So they rushed the engineering.
They rushed it severely. They pushed the battery physics way too far. They tried to cram too much capacity into too thin a physical frame, leaving absolutely no room for the battery to safely expand as it naturally heated up during charging.
And the result was spontaneous thermal runaway.
Which is the polite engineering term for it catches on fire in your pocket.
The initial corporate response was botched too, wasn't it?
Completely botched. And this goes directly back to the corporate culture. When the first reports of fires came in, they didn't do a full root cause analysis because they were in such a frantic hurry to maintain sales. They issued a quick recall, sent out replacement phones with batteries from a different supplier, and confidently told the public they were safe.
And then the replacements started exploding.
That is the ultimate nightmare scenario for a hardware company. It destroys consumer trust instantly. They eventually had to terminate the entire product line.
What was the financial impact of that?
The direct recall cost was somewhere between $3 and $5.3 billion, but Credit Suisse estimated the total indirect cost, meaning brand damage and lost future sales, was up to $17 billion.
$17 billion. That completely shattered the quality reputation they had built with the 1995 bonfire. It felt like they had regressed back to the era of shipping defective units.
It proved that the executive pressure for speed and volume had completely overtaken the mandate for safety and quality.
Now, I want to pivot a bit to the human element behind all these products. You mentioned they had 325,000 employees at their peak. What is life actually like inside Samsung? We see the shiny glass buildings and the sleek products, but what is the internal culture that produces them?
It is incredibly intense. They call their headquarters in Suwon Digital City, and it's essentially a corporate fortress. On one hand, it's a workers' utopia. They have free world-class healthcare, 500 commuter buses, 3 free meals a day, on-site dry cleaning, massive gyms. You literally never have to leave the campus.
But there's a catch to all those perks.
The catch is the sheer expectation. The culture is extremely hierarchical. In Korean corporate studies, they often call it the Director Kim culture.
Explain Director Kim for us.
In traditional Korean business, titles dictate everything. If Director Kim says a project is moving forward, you execute it. You don't challenge the premise. And you certainly do not leave the office before he does. There is a massive amount of butt-in-seat presenteeism. Even if your tasks are done, you stay at your desk until the boss goes home.
How does that cultural rigidity connect to the business failures we just discussed, like the Note 7?
It's a massive strategic liability. Think about the engineering floor for the Note 7. If you are a mid-level battery engineer and your testing shows the design might be physically unsafe, but the vice president has demanded a specific launch date to beat Apple, do you speak up?
Probably not.
In a culture where challenging authority is viewed as direct insubordination, you stay silent. That silence cost the company $17 billion.
That's a really profound point. It's not just about managers being strict. It's about systematically shutting down critical feedback loops that prevent disaster.
Exactly. And there is a much darker chapter regarding the manufacturing factory specifically that we have to address.
Right, the leukemia clusters.
Yes. Starting in the late 1990s and into the 2000s, there were alarming clusters of leukemia and lymphoma among young factory workers in the semiconductor plants. These were mostly young women handling incredibly dangerous chemicals used in chip etching.
And Samsung's reaction to this wasn't exactly transparent.
They denied any link for decades. They claimed the working environment was perfectly safe. It took an agonizing 11-year legal and public relations battle, started by the father of a 23-year-old worker who died, to get them to finally admit fault.
When did they finally apologize?
It wasn't until 2014 that they issued a formal apology. In 2018, they finally set up a compensation fund for the victims and their families. But it stands as a really stark reminder of the human cost of that rapid, unrelenting industrialization. Speed at all costs has real victims.
And zooming out from the factory floor to the boardroom, we also can't ignore the leadership structure, the Lee family's control.
It is totally Byzantine. The Lee family controls this massive $220 billion group, but not by owning 51% of the stock. They don't have anywhere near that much personal wealth. They control it through an incredibly complex web of cross-shareholdings.
How does that work in practice?
It's like a maze. Samsung Life Insurance owns shares in Samsung Electronics, which owns shares in Samsung C&T, which owns shares back in the insurance wing. It is a structure designed explicitly to keep the founding family in absolute power, regardless of what outside shareholders might want.
Which creates massive governance and transparency issues.
Huge ones. That structure directly led to the bribery scandals in 2017 involving the current chairman, Lee Jae-yong, and the former president of South Korea. He actually served prison time. It's a level of political and corporate entanglement that Western investors find very unsettling when evaluating the stock.
So if we look at the big picture, we have a company that has survived wars, literal factory fires, massive product recalls, and presidential bribery scandals. But now we arrive at the present day, and the core argument you made at the top of the show is that right now, 2024 into 2025, is actually the most dangerous time for them. Why is that?
Because of what we call the profitless volume trap. Let's look at the hard data from Q2 2023 because it paints a really stark picture of their current reality.
Hit me with the data. Let's see the numbers.
In Q2 2023, Samsung had a 20% global market share in smartphones. They shipped 53.3 million units. Apple had a 16% market share, shipping 43.2 million units.
Okay, so Samsung clearly wins on pure volume. They sold 10 million more phones than Apple.
But look at the profit generated from those sales. Samsung made roughly $1.56 billion in profit from their mobile division in that quarter. Apple made $11.05 billion.
Whoa, wait. Apple made 7 times the profit while selling 10 million fewer phones.
7 times the profit. Because Samsung is selling millions of Galaxy A and M series phones in emerging markets like India and Vietnam for maybe $200 a piece. The margins are microscopic. Apple is selling iPhones for $1,000 or more.
So Samsung is doing 7 times the manufacturing work for 1/7 of the financial reward.
They are completely squeezed. Apple crushes them at the premium top end.
Yeah.
And aggressive Chinese competitors like Xiaomi and Transsion are eating them alive at the budget bottom end. They are stuck in the middle.
But that's just the phone side. What about the semiconductor chips? That was always their safety net, right? If the mobile division had a bad quarter, the memory chips would print money and save the balance sheet.
That safety net has massive holes in it right now. This is the chip crisis. And it specifically revolves around the AI boom.
We're talking about HBM.
Yes. HBM stands for high bandwidth memory. This is the absolute critical component for artificial intelligence processing. If you buy an NVIDIA H100 GPU, which is the chip powering ChatGPT and all these massive AI models, it doesn't use standard DDR memory. It uses HBM.
What's the architectural difference? Why is HBM so incredibly hard to manufacture?
Think of standard memory like a sprawling suburban housing development. You just put chips side by side on a board. It takes up space. HBM's like building a skyscraper. You have to stack the DRAM chips vertically, one precisely on top of the other, and connect them with microscopic vertical tunnels called through-silicon vias.
So it's a packaging and architectural challenge, not just a standard printing one?
Right. It requires immense precision. And Samsung, the historical king of mass manufacturing, stumbled hard here. They were so intensely focused on mass-producing standard legacy chips, the suburb approach, that they underestimated the complexity and the sudden demand for the skyscraper approach. They completely missed the AI pivot.
And who capitalized on that mistake?
SK Hynix.
The perpetual runner-up in Korea.
Exactly. For decades, SK Hynix was the Pepsi to Samsung's Coke. They were always second best. But SK Hynix bet heavily on HBM development years ago. They mastered the stacking process, and they captured the exclusive NVIDIA supply chain. Now, SK Hynix is the clear leader in the most important chip technology of the decade, and the mighty Samsung is playing desperate catch-up.
That has to be devastating financially for their semiconductor division.
It is a bloodbath. The DS Device Solutions division profits crashed 78.6% in 2023. They actually lost money in the core chip business for the first time in over a decade. It's a massive corporate humiliation.
And the workers are noticing this structural decline, aren't they? It's bleeding into labor relations.
Yes. In June 2024, the National Samsung Electronics Union staged the first labor strike in the company's 55-year history. Roughly 28,000 workers walked out.
That is historic for a chaebol.
It signals that the old culture of unquestioning loyalty, the Director Kim era, is finally breaking. The workers want fair compensation, but they also want respect. They see the executives making strategic blunders, they see the Stark struggling, and they aren't willing to sacrifice their lives blindly for the company anymore.
So let's pull all this together and wrap it up.
Uh-huh.
We've traced the journey from a $25 noodle trader to a global tech leviathan. They burned their own inventory in a courtyard to prove a point about quality. They crushed Sony to conquer the television market. They dominated memory chips for 30 years.
But now they are fighting a brutal war on multiple fronts. Apple is suffocating them in premium mobile, Chinese OEMs are undercutting them in budget mobile, and they completely missed the start of the AI hardware wave to a domestic rival.
It's an incredibly precarious position. I know they're frantically trying to find new avenues, buying robotics companies like Rainbow Robotics, trying to find the next big thing. But you can't just acquire your way out of a foundational cultural problem.
No, you can't.
I want to end on that counterfactual we touched on earlier, the what-if scenario, because I think it perfectly highlights the tragedy of their hardware obsession.
It really is the biggest what if in modern tech history. Imagine, just for a minute, if they had paid the $50 million for Android in 2004.
If they hadn't laughed Andy Rubin out of the room.
Think about the compounding reality of that. They would own the core operating system for 70% of the world's smartphones. They would control the Google Play Store. They would take a 30% cut of every single app, every subscription, every microtransaction sold on a Pixel, a Xiaomi, a Motorola.
They wouldn't just be a hardware manufacturer anymore. They would be the landlord of the global digital economy.
Exactly. They wouldn't care if the physical hardware margins were razor thin because they'd be making billions in pure profit on software services. They would have a services revenue stream rivaling Apple's App Store. They wouldn't be reliant on Google. They would be the Google of the mobile space.
That single laugh in that boardroom, that failure to see beyond the physical metal and glass, cost them potentially trillions in market cap value over the next 2 decades.
It is incredibly sobering when you frame it that way. And it brings us to a final reflection. Back in 1993, Samsung saved itself by forcing a massive pivot from volume to quality. That was their new management philosophy.
Right.
But today, the world has shifted entirely again. We are firmly in an AI and software-dominated world. The real value has shifted from manufacturing physical things to engineering thinking things, algorithms, ecosystems, software platforms.
So the question I want to leave you with, the listener, is this. Can a company built fundamentally on the rigid command and control manufacturing efficiency of the 20th century survive in the creative software-driven chaos of the 21st century?
Or is the three-star empire destined to slowly fade, much like the Japanese electronics giants they themselves defeated 20 years ago? Remember, they beat Sony because Sony couldn't adapt quickly enough to the digital hardware era. Now Samsung risks being beaten because they can't adapt to the AI era.
History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. That is the final thought we leave you to mull over. This has been a deep dive into the rise and potential decline of Samsung. Thanks for listening to Project Blackwood.
See you on the next one.